Welcome to the She, He, We Awakening podcast. We are a wife and husband therapy team whose professional and personal lives are centered on psychology and spirituality.
We love sharing what we've learned on our journey of becoming conscious through relationship, and we invite you to get to know us and hopefully hear in our stories something that can support you in your life too.
Nice to see you again.
I know, it's been a little while.
Yes. Why don't you tell everybody what we'll be speaking about today?
Okay, so today we're going to talk about some nuances around feelings and emotions, how they differ from thoughts, because people get that confused a lot when they're trying to do their cognitive processing of what they're going through. We're going to talk about regulation, co-regulation, dysregulation, emotional dysregulation, and neurological dysregulation. We're going to talk about how to share feelings in a healthy way, including the how to share, the when to share, and the motive for sharing your feelings. We're going to talk about whether or not you should name your emotions, if that's important or not, and when that would be important and when it wouldn't be important to do that. And we're going to talk about emotional addiction. Does that exist, and in what scenarios that exists, etc.
Yes.
So that's what we're going to cover.
Okay.
Let's start with how do you differentiate feelings and emotions from thoughts? How do you know what you're experiencing is a feeling versus a thought?
Well, I think that the most obvious way to differentiate is that thoughts have words. Thoughts are we think in sentences. We think in our language, right? And so thoughts are something that could be written down in prose form.
Mm.
Right?
More than one word.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You can write it out. There's subjects, objects, verbs, all of that, all of the grammatical constructions. Those things are all
more like a sentence.
Yeah, those things are all present in thoughts. So first and foremost, thoughts are language, right? Even if it's silent, whenever we have a thought, it's happening, in my case, because I'm one of millions of sad, monolingual Americans who only speak English. Despite my years of Latin and Italian study, I can only think in English. So if I'm having a thought, it's in English. It's an English statement. I could transcribe it out of my head onto paper or through my vocal cords, and it will sound like a well-constructed or marginally well-constructed English statement. Mm-hmm. So if it doesn't have that, it's not a thought. If it does have that, it's a thought. Now, thoughts can be colored, as we'll get into, of course, with feelings and mm-hmm. emotions. That's mm-hmm. what we want to get into, establishing how to draw that line, how to distinguish. But the primary characteristic is that thoughts happen in language. Feelings do not need to happen. Feelings or emotions do not happen in language. Sometimes there's language associated with them where you can use language to try to characterize and communicate a feeling or emotion. But the feeling or emotion is not a grammatical construction.
Mm-hmm. And this becomes important because when we're in a therapeutic process or we're trying to share ourselves with someone else, there's a very big difference between communicating your feelings and communicating your thoughts. Mm-hmm. So if I were going to talk to you about a feeling that I have, the most I would really do to communicate a feeling would be to say, I feel sad, or I feel happy, I feel angry. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, you're really getting into the realm of intellectualizing your feelings or trying to translate your feelings to someone else. Right. And that can be useful, but it can also really be a hindrance. So because we deal with feelings and thoughts very differently, therapeutically and in our lives. Mm-hmm. Feelings generally need physical body support. Thoughts need intellectual processing and cognitive support.
Mhm.
There's actually, I mean to do an article on this, but there's even two different kinds of therapy. There's something called bottom-up therapy and top-down therapy. And that expression is meant to explain the different parts of the brain. So the bottom part of the brain is the hindbrain. It's like the reptilian brain, where we have our strongest reactions and fears and sort of reptilian responses to stimuli.
Yes.
And then the middle is the limbic system, where we have access to emotions, and the sensations are a little different. And then the top is meant to talk about the cerebral cortex, where thoughts and language originate. And so in a top-down therapeutic model, you would go to someone who specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, and you would talk in great deal about your thoughts and the beliefs that you have about yourself and the world and other people.
Mhm.
From a bottom-up perspective, you would work primarily with the body, doing somatic experiencing, working with the sensations of the emotions, and working your way up to talking about feelings and then exploring thoughts and beliefs. So when we're really thinking about, working with the feelings themselves, it's very important to understand that we're talking about things that are often, though they really are nonverbal. They're not
Right.
things that you can explain well.
Yeah.
At best, we can say, I feel sad, I feel happy, etc.
Yes.
And we see this a lot with clients that come in who've done a lot of talk therapy or top-down therapy, where they say, I really feel that this person shouldn't have done that. And I really feel that I am not good enough. And I really feel that, like, all of these long sentences to describe their feelings, but what they're really describing are belief systems that they have.
Yes. Which are collections of thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thoughts about the world, thoughts about themselves. And of course, these realms aren't completely distinct and non-interactive, right? It's not like we have just an emotional being and just a thinking being, and sometimes they connect and sometimes they don't. No, there's always a relationship and an interplay there.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, it's sort of a non-starter. I was going to say in therapeutic work, but it's also sort of a non-starter in effective communication and in effective relationship if we can't learn to distinguish what's a thought and what's a feeling or emotion,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I think that a really common example of this would be people who get fired up and go back and forth in language on the internet or an app, Twitter fights or Facebook discussions. It all has the appearance of being thinking, of being thoughts. It fits that primary, what's the word I'm looking for? It fits that primary rule of being language based that I mentioned is a definition of thoughts, right? Is that they're language based. And so you see all of this language on the computer popping up on Facebook or on Twitter, wherever your particular social media niche is. And it has the illusion of thinking, of back and forth thinking, right?
And rationality.
And rationality, because it's language based. But when you start to dig into it a little bit, to an outside observer who's trained to see these things, or if we're in any kind of process of self-exploration and have the ability to look at our own shares online or in person and recognize what the content of them is, it becomes apparent very quickly that these are feelings and emotions that are being translated into language, right? So these are subjective, more kind of animal brain, right? Bottom up sorts of responses that are happening. and they're being sort of translated into or superimposed onto language. And then we say, well, this is what I think about this thing, when in reality it's actually what you feel. You're
Or people are
translating your,
trying to
yeah,
translate it. Yeah.
right. So what I said about it being a non-starter, what I mean is that if we're not willing to at least understand that there's a distinction there and that it's an important distinction, then communication and relating with other individuals, like we see online, becomes very combative. It becomes non-productive. It becomes a net negative instead of a net positive. It doesn't promote growth and understanding. It just inflames and agitates and devolves very quickly, because somebody might be attempting to engage in a thought-based dialogue, and somebody else is responding from a place of feeling. And if they're not willing to acknowledge that and look at that, then it's not productive. The two
Right.
can meet.
Yeah, and it's pretty easy to tell when you're communicating with someone who's attempting to be rational and thought-based with you, but is really very triggered and emotional.
Right.
Usually the first sign of that for me is grammar goes out the window and punctuation.
Yeah.
If it's in written form.
Yeah.
That's, of course, being mindful of different people's level of education. But all things equal, that's one of the signs that people are speaking more emotionally, and they're attempting to take this big feeling that they have and make it make sense in some way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Being emotional or being triggered is more of a feeling response. Right. So one of the ways that I find has been very, very helpful to help people connect with the nuance here, it works very well when I do the psychosomatic mapping process with people in the office. So they'll come in and they've got typically some physical complaint, and we can do muscle testing and figure out where there's lack of function in the body. Something's not online, right? Something's weak and non-functional, and the communication between the brain and a joint is not there. And so they're experiencing pain or some other symptom, right? And so we use our process of muscle testing and psychosomatic mapping, and we can trace the source of that dysfunction in the joint to something in the limbic system,
Right.
something that's more in the emotional processing centers of the brain. And then we use eye movement and NLP based ideas to further narrow that down into various categories. And we can say, okay, the limbic response here is due to something that you have seen or something that you've heard, or even there's a category of thoughts, right? It's when the eyes move down and left, the brain accesses internal dialogue. Dialogue, again, words, language, those are thoughts. So it can be a thought like, I'm not good enough. That's a language. There's language there, and it's a thought that somebody can actively have, but it's a thought that we all know is interrelated to some sort of feeling and or emotion, right? It's not a strictly rational thought, because there are people who are extraordinarily successful in all facets of their life who can come in and have the thought, I'm not good enough. And if it was just a thought, it would be tossed out the window because it clearly doesn't map onto their reality, right? So it's tinged with feeling and emotion, right? And so let's say we map this out, and in the nervous system is showing that when we can resolve the problems created by that thought, I'm not good enough, the joint becomes stronger, the muscles work better, the communication between the brain and the body is restored, are optimized, right? And so how we get that to hold, including when it's a thought like I'm not good enough, what I do with people is I say, okay, I have them place their hand over a certain organ or indicated area, and they begin to just do some breathing. I start with the breathing because it's somatic, it's bottom up, right? And then once they're kind of relaxed and breathing and sort of falling into this more kind of parasympathetic state, then I'll tell them, okay, I want you to think that thought, and you're going to notice that when you think that thought, it's kind of like opening a door. And on the other side of that door is going to be like a wave of energy that hits you. And what we're actually wanting to do is spend time tuning into that energy. And so immediately using that description, what I'm doing with people is helping them distinguish between the thought and the feeling sensations. And I help them understand that the thought is really just a doorway to what's actually feeling content, right? And so you think that you have this pervasive thought of I'm not good enough, but in reality, the problem as it's showing up in the nervous system that we demonstrate to people, the problem isn't the thought. The problem is that the thought is a gateway to all of this unprocessed feeling or emotional or somatic energy. And then we go through a process of just a couple minutes of kind of keeping people going through cycles of tuning into that and treating it like it's simply a sensation, right? Like when we say feel, well, I feel with my hand, right? And so the sensation that I feel here in my hand, we call this feeling. I'm feeling sensation here. I don't confuse this with thinking. I don't have thoughts about this. It's just a sensation. And so with this process, what we can do is help people recognize that there's a thought, but that behind that is this energy that is more akin to this. It's simply sensory. Sometimes it's a tightening in the gut. Sometimes it's a constriction of the throat or a shortness of the breath, or just a wave of kind of a flavor. Sometimes I'll describe it that you can't really use language to convey. And we just have people stay with the feeling, the sensory quality of what's behind the thought. And if they do that for a couple minutes while continuing to breathe, really engaged in what's entirely just a somatic process, a bottom-up process, then suddenly they can think that thought and it doesn't cause a disruption in the nervous system anymore. Right? So that whole process, yes, it's effective, but the reason I'm sharing it is to help. It's the same reason I do it with people in the clinic, because it helps people begin to separate what thinking is from the sensory quality of a feeling. And yes, sometimes they come together in a single package. It's glued together, but that doesn't mean that the thought, for example, I'm not good enough, is thinking. It doesn't mean it's clean thinking or a clean thought. It's really a somatic, energetic response that's being translated into some language erroneously. That's the whole point, is that the thought that comes out the other end is really erroneous.
Right. Yes. And so it's important in some way, however the way that you choose, to try to separate the thoughts from the feelings that are underneath them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or recognize when, again, if we're able to do this in conversation, in relationship, in online debates, if for whatever strange reason that's your thing. It used to be my thing, so I'm being a little dramatic, but I've learned that it's not productive, right? Because people don't understand and see this nuance. And so somebody says something online that triggers them, and they have their immediate response is somatic. And then they begin to translate it into language and say, well, I think you're an idiot and blah, 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 blah. Right. It's like,
Right.
okay, technically, yes, that's language, and maybe there's some thoughts sprinkled in, but it's all being derived out of a kind of somatic reaction.
Mm-hmm. And an unexplored reaction.
Yeah.
So you're so quick to move from the somatic response into words that it comes across, very abrupt and potentially abusive.
Yes.
Yeah. So how this shows up in, the clinic, sometimes we see people who have had a lot of top-down therapy, and they have the appearance of knowing themselves very well. They can come into a therapist's office and say, I know that these are my triggers, and this is how I cope with those, and this is what I tell myself when those triggers arise. And the problem with that is that people like that are just managing their feelings with their intellect, or managing them from a top-down perspective, but the body doesn't feel better.
Right.
So I'm a good example of that. I had 5, 7, whatever, some amount of years of therapy focused on working on my belief systems, what I thought about myself, what I thought about others, how I felt in relationships. And a lot of the therapy that I did was hypnotherapy, which I think got really good results from the middle of the brain and from the top of the brain, where I really thought very differently about myself and thought very differently about others and felt differently. But it didn't do a great job of getting into the bottom of the brain, where I would still have, you've seen me like be startled very suddenly, or just holding a lot of stress and tension in my body, but my mind is peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm a very good example of someone who has done lots of healing top down, but hasn't. I'm now working on that bottom layer through acupuncture and different other kind of Eastern medicine strategies to finish the whole thing up, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there are people that we see too that have done a lot of bottom up therapy, but they still have the same thought patterns, and they haven't really done any work to clear those out. And they may dance or do yoga or meditate, but they don't know how to be in relationships.
Right. Yeah. Of course, I know this is not news to you. I think of a particular sort of group that you hovered around
Sure.
for
Yeah.
a while.
Women's groups. Yeah.
And yes, there was a lot of bottom up processing,
Mm-hmm.
very similar to what I just described, that I take people through in the clinic to help kind of connect them with the reality of the bottom up aspect of what they're going through. And in those situations, because again, it's not that one of these is right or the other is wrong, or right. It's there. We're really just the one thing.
Mm-hmm.
We are a body mind. We are the one entity, the one unit that has different perspectives. There are different ways to engage with it, etc., that seem to be helpful at different times. And are there, it's these different perspectives or different approaches are useful, different ways of seeing the world and seeing ourselves. And so this particular group, you would come home and sort of describe some of what was going on. And because I've been admittedly more of a top-down bias over the years historically. And it's a situation where there's a lot of people feeling it's very, very somatic, and there's lots of processing, but there's no thinking to support long-term change. Right. And so what happens, and it's not just that I've sort of witnessed this secondhand. I witnessed it with clients that I work with. I've witnessed it in myself. If there's just the somatic processing, if there's just the feeling, and there's no contextualization, and thinking and logic and rationality are what provide the contextualization, then people can end up just being in these patterns of somatic processing forever. And it's years, right. It's years and years and years of sort of like wailing and agony and
raging,
etc.
writing angry poetry.
Right. And so those people, if this sounds like somebody who's listening, you can then think maybe perhaps there's more of a top-down approach that's needed. Maybe cognitive behavioral approaches or traditional talk therapy, something that uses the cerebral cortex and its functions to contextualize the feelings and what's happening in your life might be of use.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You've shared this example before of you personally, so I don't think I'm telling stories out of school to bring it up. But remember the sad pills?
Yeah.
Like that would be a great example. So you had started taking a particular, I think it was an herb,
It
right?
was an herb for my lungs because I was recovering from COVID.
Okay. So you were taking some herbs, and again, it's more nuanced, but we're just going to kind of dumb it down here as an
Yeah.
example. And, for some weeks, you're just like weeping constantly, right? Like you're
Yes.
just really sad all the time. And you're
Mhm.
communicating this to me, right?
I've- Yes, it was about 5 days.
Okay.
It wasn't weeks,
Was it
thankfully,
only 5 days?
because of you. Yes, because of
Okay.
you.
Because of me. Go me.
Mhm.
And so after
Mhm.
about 5 days, and you connected the dots,
Yeah.
right? You had some sense that this medicine, these herbs that you were taking related to the lungs, it was bringing up a lot of grief. And after like 5 days, you're kind of over it. And you're like, I'm just
Yeah.
sick of being sad all the time. And I just don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And I said, stop taking the pills.
Right.
And you're like, I could do that. Right. And so you were caught
Yeah.
up in the somatic I mean,
Yeah.
share your experience, but what I'm trying to use as a teaching point here is just that you were actively engaged in something that was probably very good for you and very necessary and needed and helpful in this bottom-up process. Something about these herbs opened up lung chi and got you in touch with old grief, et cetera, et cetera. But then
Well, that's
maybe
the
I don't.
thing, though. That's
Okay,
the thing.
go
So
ahead.
I think it was a false bottom up.
Ah,
And I think that, so if you remember around that same time, you and I we did a colon cleanse, we did a liver cleanse, and we did a kidney cleanse.
mhm,
And as I was going through these cleanses, I was having all of these emotions arise. And so I thought, man, I can't believe there's so much still left to be released.
mhm.
Like I've been doing this for 7 years. You'd think I'd be through it, or I'd, have some
Yeah,
kind of sense of like, what is this stuff?
right.
And there was this was like, I don't know, I guess 2020. I was in the basement, like meditating and crying every morning
Yeah.
and all this stuff. And I thought it was just part of my process.
Mhm.
Um, but then when I took the lung pills, I didn't really connect the dots till later. But what I realized when I was taking those pills is that you can have feelings that are triggered by imbalances in the body that are not trauma related.
Mhm.
So the lung is associated with grief.
Right.
Kidney is associated with fear. When kidney meridian or lung meridian is out of balance, those emotions are out of balance.
Or
And so
those emotions come up in response to the imbalance.
the imbalance, but not because of some experience that I'm
Right.
processing,
Right.
not because I've suppressed, decades of grief and I'm still not like done. Literally, the physical body itself had an imbalance that was revealing itself
Mm.
in this emotional reaction.
Yep.
And so I don't think I was doing bottom up therapy at that time. I think had thrown myself out of balance by taking those lung pills that weren't really right for me. I had found them by like Googling and talking to a friend. I mean, I
Yeah.
hadn't gone to an acupuncturist. I was just trying something because I felt like my lungs weren't any better after COVID. So I guess that's something to be aware of too. As
Yeah.
we're exploring, sometimes the physical body is out of harmony. And so if you find yourself really angry, really sad, really worrying a lot, you can also think about your organs, think about your physical body. And if you can't intellectually connect it to some thing that's working its way out, it's possible the body itself needs support.
Right. Right. Okay. So in your particular case, it wasn't necessarily bottom up therapeutic, but it was a bottom up experience. And so bottom
Sure.
up meaning body based,
Yeah,
right?
limbic
Lower.
and reptilian brain
Yep.
reactions,
Yep.
not mental. I had no thoughts associated with these emotions, and that's what confused me.
Right.
I'm like, I'm not sad about anything, and nothing has happened in my life.
Yes. And so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the moment, a lot of this revelation came later. In the moment, there was a treating it like you were engaged in bottom up therapy.
Sure.
And again, for the point of this conversation, to help people understand, it's I mean, to your point exactly. In your case, it was pills,
Hmm.
particular pill. In other people, it's just, we're going to get into the addiction talk later, but we can just say, instead of addiction, let's just say a pattern of only engaging from the body up. And
Hmm.
just like your example, if you had just kept engaging in bottom up patterning, you would have continued to feel sad. And it took a sort of top down stimulus, a thought like, okay,
Yeah.
hey, you've connected the way you're feeling to this particular pills. What if you just stopped taking those pills? How would that?
Right.
And you did, and you felt better.
Right.
So the
Yeah.
solution there was top down, because there was an excess of that sort of bottom up approach.
Yeah,
Now,
it was top down in that I needed my intellect and my reasoning mind to understand, oh, nothing has actually happened here. You're not having a problem and your relationships are all fine. So
yep,
stop taking this pill or stop doing this. Sometimes it's stop doing this pattern. Stop watching sad things on TV or TikTok and
yes,
expecting to feel joyful.
yep,
Like stop consuming the thing that is
yes,
making you feel sad or angry or
yes.
whatever,
That's
right?
a great, yeah, that's a great choice of words, because consumption can mean, in your case, literally ingesting a
Mhm.
pill, but consumption, we also consume media, we
Mhm.
consume relationships, so to speak. Any energy or input into the system is a consumption via the nervous system. Yeah, and
Yeah,
so we're advised to pay good attention to what it is that we're consuming, right? Like we do this with food.
right.
um like, okay,
Ideally.
I know that every time I eat dairy, I feel physically ill. So I'm going to listen to the sort of bottom up response, and I'm going
Hmm.
to come and meet that with a top down understanding. Oh, dairy causes nausea or gastric distress. i'm going to I'm going to stop eating dairy.
Yeah, or I'm going to find out why that's happening
Right.
and fix it. Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we all have, I mean, according to Chinese theory, we all have natural predispositions because of how we were born, how our mothers nourished themselves, the stars, whether we're Scorpio or Cancer or whatever. We have these influences that we're born under, um, neurologically, physiologically, energetically, etc.
Hmm.
And so part of awakening, coming to know oneself, is coming to know one's patterns. And so one of my patterns is to overindulge in sadness.
Mm.
And so I know if this is something I watch myself very carefully. And also one of my patterns is to overindulge in fear
Mm.
and worry.
Yes,
So I'm
that's a
very
recent
careful.
revelation for you.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
have to be very careful about, okay, like in my leisure time, I've now spent 4 hours listening to and holding space for people who are processing fear and worry and sadness. Is it the best use of my time to then go watch some very dramatic television show that stresses me the fuck out?
Yes. And the answer is usually no, and so we're left
No.
watching Bridgerton.
I know it minimizes what I can comfortably consume on my off work hours.
Yeah,
And thankfully you're very supportive of that.
yeah. But it's so interesting, as this wasn't where we planned to go necessarily, but you're in the midst of describing this interplay between an appreciation for the sort of bottom up or the emotional and feeling content of your being, and how that pairs in a healthy, functional way with the cerebral cortex and thinking, right? Like you had the thought, the thought is, I don't want to watch your stupid space alien sci-fi show right now because it's a relatively high stress display and revs my nervous system up. And I just spent a lot of time engaged in deep empathetic work. And what I need now is parasympathetic experience. All of that I just shared, none of that is feeling or emotion.
Right.
That's thinking. You could have, or someone could in the same situation, come home from work and I put on the sci-fi or whoever.
Any
It's
number
not a
of
strange person
normal
coming into my
TV
house. You're
shows.
following along. Everybody's following along. Right? Somebody comes home and a spouse puts on a loud TV show and says, well, I think this show's stupid. Like, okay, no, that's not a thought. That's a somatic feeling, toned sort of reaction being translated, poorly translated into English.
Right.
Right. And you must not love me because you won't, I mean, you could take this as far as you want to take it. I'm not meaning to be absurd about it, but
right.
This will resonate with people. These things happen. Right.
Right.
And then you can get into a whole fight, a quote, thinking fight about TV time versus together time, et cetera, all exacerbated by the inability to distinguish between a thought and a feeling.
Right. It's not really what the fight is about.
Right.
It's on the surface about who's watching what TV program or, who didn't do this or didn't do that. But it has its roots in a somatic experience that people really struggle to articulate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So here's a question.
Great.
So if I'm the one who comes home and I don't know, let me change the TV programming. Let me put on like a really dumb reality TV show with people like screaming at each other.
Yeah. Which literally, it was either last night or the night before. I think you were on the phone with me and I was in the kitchen and one of those was on and I'm in there having a reaction.
I was watching a reality show.
Well, no, I literally think you just had the TV. It was like the Netflix preview, like it was sitting on the preview and the preview cycles through. I'm standing there in the kitchen having all kinds of quote thoughts.
Yeah.
And anyway, continue. It's a relevant example is my point.
So whose responsibility are the feelings, the responses that you are having? Is it my responsibility or is it your responsibility or is it shared responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I'm going to try not to go based on where I know you are and my predictions of where what plank you're trying to lead me down to walk off. I will simply I will simply do my
Walk on
best
your own path.
to answer authentically. My first inclination in all of these situations is to take care of myself. So I place responsibility here first. And so in this particular, you could take this microcosmic example of me being in the kitchen and having a response to reality TV, a reaction to reality TV, and you can just sort of blow that up, right? And go, okay, well, what's going on here? I could do cognitive behavioral therapy to have conversations about what it is I find so sort of annoying or difficult about that. I can do some somatic processing. I can do bottom up. I can just sit with my feelings. I can meditate in the tension of what's being created when I see that and hear that happening. All of that's fine. I can also just recognize, sort of like with the sad pills example, I can just recognize that this is a stimulus that my nervous system finds unpleasant. And there doesn't have to be a therapeutic response to that or reason or cause, or it doesn't have to be a problem. Right. Some people like rap and R&B and other people like country and heavy metal. So I like classical, other people hate it. A mentor friend of mine To this day, I remember him describing how he couldn't listen to classical music because strings make him tense. And I'm thinking, how in the hell does a cello make you uptight? Like,
Yeah.
it's one of the most relaxing, right?
Yes.
People have different nervous systems constructed in different ways and
Yeah.
respond to different. People like different foods. They like different art and color, right? So none of that has to be a problem. So yes, I can do somatic work around the annoyance
The
of
reality TV show.
using my language very carefully. Um, I can do some top-down thinking, cognitive exploration of what's going on, and I can just recognize I don't like this stimulus.
Yeah.
I find it to be unpleasant, and just like I find lima beans to be unpleasant, and I don't need to do therapy around that. I can just choose not to eat lima beans. I'm a big boy now. Can't make me. Can't make me do it.
Yeah.
And so all of that applies in a situation like this, right?
Mhm.
And then I would say that any responsibility that you might have simply comes in terms of responsibility to a relationship. It's
Right.
not really your responsibility to take care of me in that moment and fix it.
Mhm.
Certainly, there is an invitation for you to engage in a degree of responsibility for contributing to and being a part of a healthy relationship that might go something like, hey, do you mind if I watch this right now?
Mhm.
To which I might reply, yes, I do.
Mhm.
Which you may reply, okay, fine, we'll watch something else. Or, well, how would you feel about going somewhere else? Because I'm like really hooked on this. And great.
Yes.
Those are,
I need it.
yeah, my
Terrible reality show
my
fix.
heroin injection of
Well,
drama.
what if I know that you are really overstimulated by reality TV and that you hate it and I play it anyway? Whose responsibility is it now?
Well, I would still say that it my feelings are my responsibility.
Mhm.
I'm going to say, period.
Mhm.
What that translates into is a different question, right? If I'm constantly having to find ways to take care of myself because you won't take into consideration how my nervous system is constructed and what my needs and desires are, well, then we've got a relationship problem for sure.
Yep.
And once we have a relationship problem, well, now it is your responsibility, right? You have
Mhm.
some responsibility to the relationship. You don't have to take care of my feelings, but there will be an impact on the relationship. And once now it's a when it's now it's a relationship problem, not just a my nervous system problem, then there's responsibility there for you to pick up or not, right?
Yeah, I think that's where couples get or people get into difficulty when there has been a communication of a boundary
Mhm.
or a problem and the other person continues to do the behavior that is the problem
Mhm.
or has been identified as a problem for this other person.
Yeah.
And then it's not that a lot of people say in therapy, well, my feelings or your feelings are not my responsibility,
Right. So I'm just
which
going to continue to act the way that I am with zero
I can
concern
just
for your
keep
feelings.
being an asshole.
Right.
Um, that's a truth to some degree because we have very little control over other people's feelings. We can't really control them. We can certainly support them or increase them. We have influence, but we don't have control.
Yes. Yes. Just like in astronomy, since you messaged that earlier, I reference astronomy because there's a great quote from a very well-known and well-respected astrologer that says that the stars compel, they do not impel,
Mhm.
right? And that's such a concise way of expressing the relationship to astrology, or the relationship between two people and the responsibility for feelings. Is the stars or our relationship, they definitely can influence, they can and do influence, but they are not in control of.
Right.
So ultimately, the control, you can't impel me to feel a certain way. It's my responsibility, but you can compel me to feel a certain way based on your behavior. And it's just
Mm-hmm.
the nature of relationship. I'm going
Yeah.
to have responses in my nervous system to what you're doing or not doing, or, choices you're making, etc.
Right. Yeah. So it's very important when you're in a relationship to not have an expectation of the other person that if you do something harmful, hurtful, not conscious, unconscious, or um, yeah, just not meaning well, that the other person should be, peaceful and tranquil and just centered and grounded in themselves all the time. Like
Right.
that's an unrealistic expectation.
Yes.
Likewise, if if you're growing up in a situation where you're being abused or harmed in some way and it's ongoing, it keeps happening, or if you're in an abusive relationship as a grown up, you can't expect yourself to not have reactions, responses, and strong emotional feelings
Yep.
about those things. And until you remove yourself from or you are removed from those situations, you you're not going to get better.
Right.
Hmm. You're not going to feel better.
Yes. So I think, having gone through that example, I just want to revisit here this distinction between feelings and emotions and thoughts. One is
Hmm.
that, depending on who people are listening to, I think it's important to recognize that not everybody uses these words to mean the same thing exactly.
Hmm.
And so just know that. For me, I do distinguish between feelings and emotions. I think when most people talk about feelings, they're actually talking about what I call emotions.
Yeah.
They're talking about some amalgam of somatic uprising, a somatic experience, coupled with a reaction. To me, that's an emotion.
Hmm.
I like to use feeling to mean strictly sensation.
Okay.
Um, doesn't mean I'm right. Just know that when I'm using that language, that's how I mean. And other
Hmm.
people, you're going to hear other people talk about feeling, and they mean what I call emotions.
Sure.
And the reason, I think one of the reasons that I draw that distinction is because of, the long history of doing neurological work with clients, and the neurological work is sensory or feeling based.
Hmm.
Right? You think about going to a neurologist and they're kind of, poke you with something sharp to say, can you feel this? Yes, I can. And that doesn't have an emotional charge to it. So for me, feeling is the sensations that arise in and around the body. Emotions are those sensations that arise coupled with an unconscious activation of some content within us, within the unconscious, that elicits some sort of reaction out of us.
Hmm.
And then we begin to layer explanatory mapping onto that reaction, and that looks and sounds like thoughts, right? And so there's the sort of bottom up. The most bottom that you can get is the strict raw sensory data that's being gathered by the nervous system. And then above that is more of an emotional reaction coupled. It's the sensory information coupled with some sort of reaction based on history, trauma, programming, belief systems, etc. And that's still not quite thinking yet, but it's a more visceral, reactive kind of response,
Hmm.
that I call emotion. And many people say these are my feelings. That's fine. And then all of that will feed up. I mean, literally, this is how the nervous system works. It gathers that, and it takes all that information and brings it up the spinal cord through the reptilian brain, and a lot of that data then begins to make its way to the cerebral cortex. My point with all of this dull neuroscience is that there are no thoughts that really come independent of that other data, right? Nothing in our wiring, in order for something to move through our wiring to the point where it gets to the cerebral cortex, it has to go through the rest of the nervous system. And so my caveat here for people is to just take the whole thinking approach with a grain of salt. Yes, we're talking about distinguishing thinking from feelings and emotions. That's important. Also, at the same time, recognize that there's a very good argument that it's impossible to have a thought that isn't preceded by some sort of more somatic feeling and emotional charge or process or energy.
Right.
In other words, the thoughts emanate out of that. And then also, but then somebody might say, well, then what's the point of even focusing on thinking if everything starts below? Well, because it's a circular process, because your thinking is then going to dictate back down into the nervous system more information that it's going to respond to. And so there's this back and forth,
Right.
up and down communication. But despite that fact, my point here is that there's a very good argument that whatever thought you're having, if you think it's a totally clean, unbiased thought that there's no way that this could be contaminated by feelings or emotions, there's a very good scientific argument that there's no such thing.
Mm.
It doesn't mean we don't use the thinking function. Tell me your thoughts on that, or your emotive thoughts on that, even.
Well, I feel like no. What I'm thinking about this is that I don't differentiate between feelings and emotions the way that you do, because it's happening so fast in my system. I don't have a way of saying, oh, I'm having a feeling versus, oh, I'm having an emotion.
Yeah, and practically speaking, I would actually say that makes a great deal of sense.
But what I do think is useful about, well, I think the whole conversation is useful, but what I love about this is that I now know how you describe and define feelings and emotions. So when you're talking about your feelings and emotions and you're saying, I'm having an emotion, I'm having a feeling, that gives me clues on how to be with you.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter to me anyway how people define feelings and emotions, as long as they can express it to me how they are defining it.
Yeah.
So I know how to meet them
Mm-hmm.
in some way. I think the difference between feelings, emotions, and thoughts, however, is important to have be on the same page about, because those are feelings and emotions you're going to probably interact with very similarly. Feelings and thoughts you interact with very differently.
Agreed. Yeah.
You need to meet. I mean, sometimes you'll need to have a feeling-based approach, and you'll also need to have a thought-based approach at the same time, but usually you do one or the other. This might be just a bit random and out there for the thought, when you were saying that you can't have a pure thought. If sometimes I do experience thoughts that they don't seem to have emotions and feelings associated with them.
Yeah.
And I tend to be very empathic, and I would look at those thoughts suspiciously and wonder if I'm picking up on someone else's thoughts, because
Mm-hmm.
thought energy in and of itself is a thing that we can be attuned to in other people. And so
Agreed.
that's just one little nuance about thoughts. But
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, this could be a whole series of podcasts and several books. So yes, there's a lot of nuance that we're trying to sort of distill down here into a useful conversation. So that's one example.
yeah,
Another example would be that anybody who has meditated for any significant period of time, will have recognized that thoughts actually don't arise within us as in our body, in our personal. They're not personal. Thoughts are not personal,
Mhm.
and they don't arise from within the person. And that's going to sound totally contradictory to what I just said about information being gathered by the more somatic processing centers and moving up to the cerebral cortex, where we go, aha, I have a thought. And I get that, but there's probably then a second category of quote thoughts
Mhm.
that we would want to find a different word for. I'm not going to bother with that right now, but yes, a counterpoint would be sitting down in meditation and in perfect stillness and peace, and then just like that, bam, there's a language-based sentence
Mhm.
that is there. Where that comes from and how it's processed through the nervous system is totally sort of up for debate, but
Mhm.
yes, I agree with you that there is also a thinking that happens that is clean, but it's a spontaneous, impersonal thinking that I would almost want to find a different word for, because it's not the kind of thinking that we're talking about
Right.
as it pertains to being in relationship and how our thought patterns on a
Mhm.
daily basis, things like that.
Right.
Um, it's really more the thinking of the universal mind that you're describing. We can plug into, we can be tapped into, and then a thought arises and it's quote not ours.
Yeah, and similarly with emotional feeling energy, way back when I was first learning about all this, I was trying to figure out, okay, like I suddenly feel sad. Am I feeling my own sadness? Am I feeling someone
Mhm.
else's sadness? Um, that was a process for me to try to figure that out.
Yep.
I think what I notice now when I'm with people is that my nervous system and someone else's nervous system are basically in dialogue with one another. And of course, then there's the one energy that my experience is that we are all a one kind of energy anyway. So my feelings, someone else's feelings, it's kind of all the same stuff. But it's still important to recognize, when something has happened to you, specifically you, that is triggering a response in your nervous system, and thus it needs to be taken care of within your own nervous system,
Mhm.
versus you're walking into some room or scenario and people are having emotions or thinking about something and having emotions, and nothing has occurred within your own system. Nothing has originated, so to speak, in your own nervous system, and that requires a different kind of response,
Mhm.
or maybe the same kind of response but a different perspective.
Yeah.
If I know that I'm going through something, I'm going to be with myself in a different way than if I know someone around me is going through something. I might take different actions. I might try to comfort someone, or maybe I'll leave the room. Depends
Sure.
on what I need.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree that we've all had the experience of like walking into a room and recognizing there's this tension in the room,
Yeah.
right? And going, oh, right. But instinctively in moments like that, because there's an instant top down sort of response, a
Hmm.
thinking based response, which is there's tension in this room,
Hmm.
right? That thought form has with it the implication that this isn't really arising within me. There's nothing for
Hmm.
me to do here. And so the response is again going to be different, like, well, I think I'll walk into a different room now, or I'm gonna leave, or whatever. Or maybe you crack a joke and cut the tension and then everybody feels better, including you, right? That's
Right.
very different from just sort of being in tension within yourself. There's a different
Yes.
level of responsibility, so to speak, a different way of taking care of that situation, when it's arising from within. I think that one of the dangers here, there's probably many, is people who identify as empathic.
Hmm.
And I don't just mean people who know or feel that they have a strong sense of empathy. I mean people who walk around saying, I'm an empath,
Hmm.
an identifying statement. I have seen a tendency with people who identify as an empath to consistently dissociate or place the responsibility onto the world or others around them. And
Hmm.
so then suddenly everything that they're feeling it's not really my feeling. It's just I'm so empathic that I'm constantly picking up the feelings of the people around me and the world around me.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of a kind of sacred wound.
Powerlessness.
Yeah, like a powerlessness. Well, this is my sacred wound. This is my cross to bear. There's nothing I can do about it. Kind of a
Mhm.
victim energy that can arise. Not always, but it can. And it's a caveat worth mentioning that
Mhm.
um, you want to be able to distinguish. But if suddenly there's this habitual way of being in the world that says, well, everything that I'm feeling is really just my tuning into what's happening outside me, that's problematic for a lot of reasons that we won't necessarily get into right now.
Yeah, it is problematic, and when people are doing that, I suspect, and when I've done that, I suspect it's because those people or myself haven't had enough experience being alone and still with themselves to
Mhm.
know their own neurological responses. I mean, really, it's an energetic and neurological response.
Yeah.
So if I walk into the room or I go someplace and the energy is too much for me, that gives me a lot of information. It tells me that um, probably I'm very fatigued and dysregulated to begin with
Mhm.
if I'm going to be that easily tossed out of balance.
Right.
And I need to do some bottom up strategies to let help my body release tension.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you for making that point. So speaking of regulation, we have, there's a few options. If you find yourself feeling emotional or feeling your feelings, whatever, or having thoughts that are creating feelings, whatever it is, there's a few ways that we as humans can work through it. One of them is to learn how to regulate ourselves. And of course, there's like, if you think about it as a tree, there's like two branches, and off the, self-regulation, there's like 50 branches of possible ways you can do that, including dancing, exercise, meditation, massage, chiropractic, all kinds of body related strategies. And then there's something called co-regulation, where you would hopefully, with the acceptance of someone, a partner or a friend, you would come close to another person's nervous system who was more regulated than you. And the two nervous systems basically talk to one another and find harmony and find balance. Now, most of us experience this by like hugging, snuggling, getting massage, getting body work, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And the problem, well, there's, I mean, of course, as humans, we're made to co regulate with one another. It's often the fastest and easiest path to becoming regulated, as long as you have someone who can hold that space for you. However, if you're always needing someone else to be present for you when you're feeling dysregulated or emotional triggered, then when something happens like the pandemic, you are SOL, because
Right.
you're not supposed to be around anyone else, and or the people that you count on and rely on are also dysregulated. Then you might have to find yourself seeking a self-regulatory strategy.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of talk in psychology about co-regulation and self-regulation. I just wanted to throw that little nuance in, that you ideally should be practicing both.
Yes. And if you're if you can only exclusively co-regulate, then that's being codependent,
Hmm.
right? You are depending on co-regulation to regulate, then you're just dependent or codependent.
Hmm.
So nope, again, like the example of the television show and who's responsible. There's nothing wrong with being in relationship and respecting one another and co-regulating, helping one another feel better.
Sure.
Wonderful, great. But ultimately, we need to have the ability to take care of or regulate ourselves.
Sure. I mean, as a parent, we try to teach that to our kids from very young age.
Right.
One of the things that was in vogue when I was raising my kids was something called the cry it out method.
Mm.
Now, knowing what I know now, I would never do that again. The theory was to teach the child to self-regulate
Yeah.
and self-soothe by crying for a little bit and then calming down.
Yeah.
Calming themselves down, finding the pacifier, finding the stuffy, whatever it was. Sometimes it's either unethical or impossible for someone to self-regulate. So you do need a little bit of cognition, I think. This is
Yes.
my feeling.
Yep.
I don't know that it's proven by science or not proven by science, but I believe that you need a little bit of cognition and support of your mind to be able to say, okay, I need to take care of myself right now. What can I do to take care of myself? Okay, I can snuggle up in a blanket. I can take a hot shower. I can have whatever, something to eat. I think you need to have a somewhat developed rationale or reasoning to be able to be good at self-regulating.
Agreed. Yeah.
Or else you're going to be liable potentially to form habits that are not healthy.
Yeah. And maybe we should use that to segue into addiction.
Okay. Sure.
Because that's a habit.
It is.
Yeah.
Well, yes, addiction can be a habit of self-soothing in a way that's harmful.
Right.
But I was wanting to talk about addiction to emotions.
Right. That's
That
what I meant. Yeah.
whether that even exists. Does that exist? I think I've heard a lot about this lately. If you feel a certain way repeatedly, maybe you're addicted to your feeling. Maybe you like feeling angry and you can't let it go. Or maybe you like being sad and you can't let it go.
Mm-hmm.
And I tend to think of that if someone is feeling a certain way repeatedly, there's either an intellectual addiction to the feeling, like
Mm-hmm.
you're thinking you have a belief system that keeps you in a feeling, or there's a physiological dysregulation, a neurological dysregulation, or something wrong with your body that's keeping you feeling a certain way. So
Yeah.
I used to feel hurt a lot. And I can remember my therapist saying, well, if you feel hurt a lot, you probably should do a complete clearing on feeling hurt and clear all the causes. And after I did that complete clearing, magically, I still felt hurt, or unmagically, I guess. I still felt hurt sometimes, and I felt hurt when it was appropriate. But a lot of the patterns of reacting with feeling hurt had been resolved. Basically, the belief system, I think, the belief system that caused me to feel hurt all the time was cleared, was worked out. What do you think about emotional addiction?
So I agree with everything that you've shared. I will offer a different context, which is the language that I would use here for people to engage with is to ask, what's the ego payoff for a particular pattern of emotion? And yes, there's an invitation there to do a top-down thinking based, okay, well, let me map out here, like, what am I getting out of this? And there's probably going to be an aversion to that at the beginning, because this will often be dealing with things that people are ostensibly sick of and saying, I'm done with this, I don't want to be sad anymore, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And what's the ego payoff? What's a possible ego payoff that one is getting out of this? And see where it leads you. So for example, Well, I've noticed, and I think I've shared in one of our many podcasts at some point, like I have noticed that I feel a certain degree of payoff in the past, when I have gotten sick and you'd take care of me. I'm like, oh, this is the best. I mean, I feel terrible, but oh man, I just get to lie here on the couch and watch whatever I want, and she's gonna bring me soup and rub my feet. Like, man, right? So there's a recognition there. Like, do I want to be sick? No. I would prefer to always feel good and be healthy.
Hmm.
But despite that, I needed to recognize that there was some unconscious ego payoff taking place. And just being able to recognize that and name it helped it to shift. Right. And, knock on wood, haven't been sick in quite some time now. So, um, so I think asking what the ego payoff is, literally meaning doing the exploration, but also just asking it in in a more general and abstract, nondescript way that has sort of an energetic or somatic practice to it, which is to simply assume
Hmm.
that if you have a pattern, so for me, a pattern of feeling angry over the years, that I don't have to necessarily think about it and figure it out. I can just assume there is an ego payoff to feeling this way, some sort of validation or righteousness or whatever. It doesn't really even have to have a word. It's got a flavor to it
Sure.
that defies language. And so in the moment, the practice is to feel oneself reacting in the same emotional pattern, recognize that the ego is inviting us to sort of dive into that and really get invested in it. And we can just sort of surrender that and step back and actually reject the ego payoff. And this is subtle, but I'm convinced that we can pay attention and recognize that this ego payoff is there anytime there is this sort of quote addiction. So my answer is
Mm.
yes, in the conventional usage of the word, I do think we can be emotionally addicted. I think we can be addicted to specific emotions.
Mm.
It's not necessarily physiologic per se. Um, I think it's an ego addiction, and we don't have to have a great deal of information about it, or we don't have to map it out and think about it, until we can make perfect sense of it. To just begin rejecting that
Mhm.
ego payoff
Mhm.
and recognize this in this subtle way that every time I feel angry, there's something that I sort of attach myself to, or every time I feel sad or whatever. And you can really just take a deep breath and sort of let go of that energy.
Yeah. I do think I agree with everything you said, and I know that I certainly have looked at it within myself. I have. Thinking about my attachment to worrying, my attachment to feeling sad, my attachment to feeling like a victim or powerless. Um, I think some harm is possible if you are literally in acute trauma.
Agreed.
Someone is hurting you, someone is abusing you, or there's something going on in the world where you feel angry about it or sad about it, um, and can't seem to break out of that pattern because you're still living in it.
Yes. Yeah. So again, there's no one right way, right? We don't just engage in top down without the information from the sensory and feeling system. We don't just process somatically without thinking about what's going on. Yes, I totally agree that that's a significant risk,
Yeah.
that if there's a pattern of being angry that happens to coincide with a pattern of being in the same abusive relationship for many, many years, that this not there still might be ego payoff, but in this case, the ego payoff isn't keeping you angry per se. The ego payoff is keeping you in the relationship.
Sure. Keeping you doing the thing that
Right.
is associated with the anger or whatever.
That's
Yeah.
right. So in a case like that, yeah, the answer isn't like to just sort of let go of the anger as a egoic pattern and not do anything. We
Right.
have to think about what's happening as well. Yeah, totally. Any one of these kind of vectors that we come from to sort of analyze our psyche, explore ourselves, deepen our direct experience of ourself. Any one vector overdone to the exclusion of other vectors is a problem, will become a
Mhm.
problem, or has its risks or pitfalls, etc.
Yeah. I think something that, a lot of people, or I have a lot of clients who are like, I'm so tired of feeling sad about this, or I'm so tired of feeling angry about this.
Yeah.
And I always say, we go through a process of, you know, the feelings that you're having make sense. Now, maybe you're not ready to be done with the anger because there's a belief system in place that's keeping it present, or um, you're not done grieving yet. Like, that has to take its process, and
Mhm.
you can't force that along. You can't force healing from something. It has to take its time, whatever time it takes. So I always think that feelings and emotions, not that they're rational, but that they make sense because there's something holding them in place.
Mhm.
Whether it's the actual experience that you're in while you're still in an abusive relationship, or you're still not, you haven't moved on, like you're grieving this person that you lost, but you haven't stepped into a new dynamic yet. So you're in this limbo place, you feel this way for a reason. And so we have to work bottom up and top down to
Yes.
help you get through it.
Yep. Agreed.
Mm. So, do you think that we should name our emotions and feelings? Well, I guess for maybe feelings in your way of understanding things,
No, it would be more
or
emotion.
emotions.
Yeah. I
Okay.
mean, you can name feelings too, right? Like
Mhm.
neurologically, like that feels like pressure. This feels like touch, right? But
Yes. Okay.
I digress. Um, I I think they're two different vectors, just like so many of the other things we're talking about. And they both have their time and place, and I wouldn't do one with to the exclusion of the other. So so for me, going back to that psychosomatic mapping process, um what I find that the situation that many people are in
Mhm.
is that they feel a certain way that they're sick of feeling. They've felt that way for a long time. They have all sorts of understanding of where it's coming from, or who it seems to be about, or why it's there, or what triggers it, etc.
Mhm.
In other words, they've thought about it a lot,
Yep.
right? And the thinking about it includes naming it typically. And so if people have been doing that and living in that energy, what we see work really well in terms of helping the nervous system function more optimally. I mean, this is not helping in a vague way. This is helping
Mhm.
like in a way that we immediately test sort of before and after
Mhm.
on the table, and people respond with, wow, like, no, my this pain that I had has gone away, or I feel instantly better, etc.
Yeah.
So there's this before and after testing. And in that process, what I have people do is, again, name the emotion at the beginning to recognize what it's about, or
Mhm.
because the naming of it and the thinking about it acts as the doorway
Mhm.
to the somatic experience that they've never really spent time with.
Yeah.
That's the difference, right? Is that people say, well, no, I'm really in touch with my anger. And what they mean is that they know who's at fault or what pisses them off,
Yeah.
right? Or that they are angry, period.
Sure.
Right.
Yes.
Well, that's not being in touch with your anger. That's thinking about. Remember, touch is a sensory feeling. That's not being in touch. That's knowing about.
Mhm.
I know about anger. I know about
Mhm.
my anger. I know that I'm angry, and I know why. I can
Mhm.
point to lots of reasons why, but none of that gets people into the somatic experience of simply feeling the energy and processing it without judgment.
Yeah.
And so what I will often do with people is say, okay, I want you to, think of this thing that we've identified through our testing that makes you angry. And you're going to think of that thing. And it's like, again, it's like opening a door. And you'll notice that when you open that door, you get hit with a wave of energy. And once you get hit with that wave of energy, you forget about the naming, you forget about the rationality, the reasons, the causes, the thinking, and you literally just breathe and feel,
Mhm.
breathe and feel, breathe and feel. That's being in touch with the
Mhm.
emotion, the anger. That's sort of surrendering to that somatic experience, which actually gives it a chance to move and shift within the body
Yep.
and clear out of the nervous system. So um, I think both are important. I've also had counter examples, and I know you have as well, that people come in and they have all of this sort of vague energy in the body. I feel really uncomfortable. This
Mhm.
hurts, that hurts, etc. And they're just associating their feelings with pure feeling, pure sensory experience in the body, pain,
Mhm.
the feeling of pain, right? And then you begin to have conversations, and you can sort of, we don't do this quickly, so don't take this literally, but you can sort of jump in and go, are you aware that you're really, really angry?
Mhm.
And they're, what? No, I'm not angry. And then you have a conversation, they go, holy shit, I'm actually really angry. Great. And so they've now attached a name to the quote feeling, or in my words, the emotion, that actually allows that energy to be worked with at the level that it's wanting to be engaged with, right? Like, again, because if somebody's angry, to your point from earlier, it's often because there's a reason.
Mhm.
There's boundaries that have been violated. There's problems that haven't been resolved. Um, there's a threat that is still present that hasn't been dealt with of some sort. And we can't do that sometimes if we don't recognize, oh, I'm angry. That's what this
Mhm.
is.
Mhm.
I thought it was back pain,
Yeah.
but I'm angry.
And the reason why you and I and others are able to say, are you aware that you're holding anger here? Is because we have sat with ourselves long enough to know in our own bodies what anger feels like, and to also be aware of how our nervous system responds to another person's nervous system when they are angry.
Mhm.
And so, I'm kind of careful how I say that to someone. I won't say, you're really angry, because people can sometimes not absorb that well. I'll say, do you think you're holding anger here? Does this feel like anger to you? And usually they're like, yeah, it does. And it's red or whatever, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But it's because we've learned to, like you said, open the door through via a thought or via a feeling, and touch the somatic experience of anger, of whatever is associated with anger in our own physiology. We know what it feels like. So we can place our hands on other people and say, sadness,
Yes.
fear, whatever.
Yep.
Because we have a neurological recognition, an empathic recognition of that.
Yeah.
I think sometimes, people find that strange that we can do that. And they're like, oh, you're really psychic. I'm like, if you want to call it psychic, that's fine. But what it is I have explored my own emotional reactions to such a exhausting degree
Hmm.
that it's easy for me to
Yeah.
ascertain what you might be experiencing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So you feel like perhaps, naming emotions is useful at times to open the window to being able to touch the sensation. And I would agree. For most of the time of my healing, I did need to name them in order to get to that sensory experience and to get out of my mind and my mind's interpretation of what was happening.
Right.
I think now it's less important for me to name the emotions because I have like a wordless sense of what it is. I'm like, oh, fear, okay, whatever. Do something for it. Put on my little vagus nerve stimulator or lay down for a while.
Yeah.
But for a long time, it's important.
Yeah. Again, with every vector having its sort of pitfall, I think the problem that arises with exclusively or over naming or habitually naming the feeling
Mhm.
is often that it comes with judgment,
Yeah.
which blocks us from accessing the somatic experience.
Yeah, we can't open
Like
the
for
door.
men, it's not okay to be angry,
Sure.
right? I guess there's
Or
another.
women too.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, there's a whole different sort of experience or situation in which or rationale in which that's true for women, but
Yeah.
um, I think that in my experience and in dealing with men, there's been just sort of a um, you know, there's an instant classification that comes with if you're an angry man,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That it's just not okay to be
Yeah.
angry. It's not safe for people.
Mhm.
And so if we're too busy naming anger, then we're actually rejecting the sensory experience of that out of a judgment of anger or a
Because you're
judgment
trying
of
to
fear.
avoid anger.
Yeah, or a
Yeah.
fear. Trying to avoid it or just condemning it as being bad and thinking that if I get in touch with it, then that's going to make it more true, which
Yeah.
is not how it works, right?
Or I'll feel worse.
Right. Or it's
Mhm.
not okay for me to be afraid. I shouldn't be afraid. It's not manly to be afraid. Or if I admit that I'm afraid, then, all sorts of, the house of cards will collapse or something like that. But again, that's all judgment.
Mhm.
And so in situations like that, the solution is to not name it. So, okay,
Mhm.
fine. Just think about this thing that we've identified or that's problematic and recognize that when you think about this event or situation or whatever, there's a sensory experience in the body, and you're just going to
Mhm.
ride this sensory experience for a while, and you're not going to name it. You're not going to judge it. It doesn't need to be psychoanalyzed. It just needs to be felt.
Right. And I think for a lot of people, they have to learn that with a safe person.
Hmm.
So, that's one of the reasons to do bottom up therapy. This is bottom up therapy. Going to someone who's helping you get in touch with your own body and your own sensations, not just analyzing your thoughts and feelings, and then walking you through the process until you feel safe to do it on your own.
Yeah.
But some people start to open the door to that fear and they have a full on panic attack
Right.
and they feel like they're afraid they're dying.
Right.
So that person has to be slowly walked through it so that they can do it safely on their own without calling 911. So now that we have talked at depth about feelings, emotions, thoughts, how to work with feelings and emotions, how to think about it, is there anything you want to say to wrap it up?
No.
Wrap
I
it
don't.
up.
I feel as though my sharing has been complete.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in another podcast, we talked a little bit about how you and I have strategized over time how to share our feelings with one another, how we've used words and notes and text messages and things like that. So, I don't know that we need to go into any more detail about that, but just know that you can check the first few episodes of this podcast and get more information about communicating feelings and the timing of that and how to do that.
Yes.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
it's been nice to be back at this after a long delay.
Yes, it has. So nice to see you again, love.
Nice to
Until
see
the
you
next
too.
time.
Okay. Till then.